I feel like we already had a sermon, but I guess I'm up here to preach one now, so here we go. Whenever mirrors come up in daily conversation, because you know that happens quite a bit, one of the first places that my mind often goes to is vampires. Anybody else? No? Oh, that's fine. Well, my mind probably goes to vampires because I absolutely love folklore. I think it is a fantastic sort of story record of humanity trying to understand the world around us. And vampires are actually a pretty fascinating example of this. The reason why I associate specifically mirrors with vampires is because in folklore, one of the ways you identify a vampire is that you see somebody not have a reflection in a mirror. And this piece of lore seems to come from discoveries around silver. Somehow, hundreds of years ago, it was discovered that putting silver in water actually makes the water last longer. It doesn't become dirty or scummy. This meant water could be kept for longer, which was especially important and life-saving when there were no other sources of clean water or if there was a drought going on. Nowadays, we know that scum is caused by microbes, and we also now know that silver has some antimicrobial properties. Even today, it is sometimes used in wound dressings for infected wounds in order to help speed up healing. But for people who didn't know what microbes were, it was assumed that this meant silver was a wholly pure substance and could purify whatever it touched. So when it became part of the folklore tradition of actually quite a few different cultures, it became one of the things that could defeat an impure vampire. But what does this all have to do with mirrors now? Well, traditionally, glass mirrors have been backed with silver. And since silver was seen as the epitome of purity, by its very nature, it couldn't reflect something that was impure or unholy, like a vampire. Now, this all may seem absolutely ridiculous today with all of our scientific knowledge and our advancements in technology. But even with how far we've come, there's still things we don't fully understand. And that's what Paul is here talking about today. He's writing this letter to the Corinthians only 20 or so years after Jesus' death and resurrection, which means there were still a lot of theological details that the early church was trying to figure out. And while the church in Corinth was doing its best, in some ways they were getting focused too much on the details and completely missing the bigger picture, which is very understandable because how often do we do that today? How often do we start hanging up photos, making sure they're perfectly straight on the wall, and then step back and realize they're actually slanting down the wall, unfortunately? Or how many times have we gotten so picky with a work project that just a little tiny piece of it that you completely neglect the rest of the project and have to scramble in order to get it finished? I mean, I've never done that with any of my projects here, absolutely not. And I totally didn't, in one of my early sermons, obsess over a story I was including and almost forget to write the ending to that sermon. Don't worry, it got written. But speaking of details, you might have noticed we did something a little different this morning with the scripture. Kim read it in the New King James Version. And that's because there's a word in there that doesn't appear in a lot of later translations, and that's the word dim. In the NRSV, it is translated straight up as reflection, which is a completely accurate translation. That would have been what Paul was referencing. But that translation takes away some of the context and the details as to why Paul would specifically call a reflection in a mirror dim or dark, as some other versions translate it. This was because most mirrors at the time were not made of glass, which was a fairly new invention, but instead were polished discs of different metals, including, among others, silver. Now, have you ever looked at your reflection in a silver spoon? It's not the same as looking directly in a mirror, right? It's warped, and the colors are just a little bit off. And like Paul is saying here, it's not as bright as seeing your reflection in a glass mirror. Silver just doesn't reflect light as well as glass, meaning that your face appears dim and you can't make out all of the details in the image in the mirror. It's imperfect. But what is Paul getting at that we are trying to see in this dim mirror? God? Heaven? Ourselves? Knowledge? Probably somewhere around all of the above. But let's start with God, who might be the easiest to acknowledge that we just don't know everything about. Most Christians tend to hold the belief that God is beyond our full comprehension in a lot of ways. And the Bible is full of examples of God showing just how beyond our comprehension God can be. One of which is the story of Job, which you might be familiar with. Within the span of a few verses, Job loses his oxen, donkeys, sheep, camels, the servants that were overseeing all of them, and then on top of all that, a mysterious wind collapses the house that his children were staying in. In every case, only one person manages to escape in order to tell Job. And if you thought that wasn't enough, don't worry, because then he gets boils on top of everything else in the next verse. When Job's friends tried to explain why Job had suffered so much, God intervenes and replies with a multi-chapter monologue, asking if any of them were at the creation of the world, and, on top of that, asking them to explain how nature worked. Since none of them can, God uses it as an example to show that since none of them can fully comprehend what God has created, how can they even pretend to fully comprehend God? But along with that, we also have examples of God becoming comprehensible, even if just for a moment. In 1 Kings 19, when Elijah fled from Jezebel's threats to kill him, he ends up in a cave feeling pretty alone. When he confesses this to God, God tells him to go stand out on the mountain because God is going to pass by, offering a comforting physical presence. At first, there's a powerful wind, but God was not in the wind. And there was an earthquake, and then a fire, but God wasn't in either of those. Not that God couldn't be, because all of these were examples of how God had shown up in the past. The wind that settled on the tabernacle, the earthquake that brought down the walls of Jericho, and the fire that incinerated the offering that Elijah had offered up to God in front of the prophets of Baal just a few chapters back. These all would have been the ways that Elijah had been taught that God had shown up in the past, meaning he probably expected God to be in any of the three. But this time, God showed up in a different way, one that Elijah probably wasn't expecting. It was a gentle whisper. And honestly, after everything Elijah had been through in the past few years, a gentle whisper was probably exactly what he needed. How many times do we expect to hear God as that booming voice from above? How often are we looking for the roaring fire, the earthquake, when what we should actually be listening to is the still small voice? And how often do we dismiss when others tell us how they've heard God show up, when we've never seen God show up like that before? The same God that showed up in Job is the same God that showed up in 1 Kings, but they look completely different. It's a reminder that each of us cannot experience the entirety of God alone. We only get a dim reflection, a sliver of experience throughout our lives. And at the same time, we really only see a dim reflection of the people and the world around us as well. Because like Job, the entirety of creation and humanity is still beyond our full understanding. So what do we do when we don't see a full picture, when there are gaps in our knowledge and understanding? We try to fill them in, to form that full picture of God, of ourselves, and of the world around us. And in trying to understand the world around us, we develop stories and folklore to fill in those gaps in our knowledge. For example, some of the classic traits of vampires, I promise this is the last time I'm referencing vampires in this sermon. are reflections of diseases and conditions that were actually starting to affect people for the first time. In some vampire folklore, vampires are hurt by the sun. Now, I will acknowledge some authors have decided to make them sparkle instead, but that is a huge departure from tradition, and we're going to ignore that for today. And if you don't get that reference, that's fine. I wish I didn't either, frankly. We're not entirely sure where this piece of folklore comes from, but we start seeing an increase in it being mentioned in 1800s Eastern Europe. What's interesting is that this is also the time that corn started to be introduced to the region and became one of the staple crops. Now today, we know that a corn-heavy diet can lead to a nutritional deficiency called pellagra, one of the main symptoms of which is extreme sensitivity to sunlight. But at the time, nutrition and nutritional deficiencies were largely unknown and really not being studied. But what people in the 1800s did know were vampires, and they knew that vampires only came out at night because they were repelled by sunlight. So what did they do to explain that some people suddenly became very pale and very sensitive to the sun? You might see where this is going. They were turning into vampires. Because the people there used what information they had, which was their stories and knowledge around vampires, to fill in the gaps of their knowledge about this new condition afflicting their community. They didn't have the understanding yet to connect their new diets to sun sensitivity. Nowadays, we have this knowledge and understanding to explain what happened to them in this case. But what do we still not know? Where do we still lack understanding? Are there places where we don't even know enough to realize that we don't know enough? And what stories do we tell ourselves to explain what we don't understand? The way our minds create these stories to explain something when we don't have all the information or understanding of a situation is a form of cognitive bias. Now, there's a lot of different biases that go under the umbrella term of cognitive bias. For example, anchoring occurs in our minds when we get a piece of information on a subject, and then we interpret all new information through that first piece, for better or for worse. That's how you explain people getting pellagra as to turning into vampires, because the piece of information you already had was vampires are sensitive to sunlight. Then there's confirmation bias, where we align any new information with our pre-existing beliefs, rather than questioning our beliefs in light of new information. Everyone does this on a subconscious level, and it's not always a bad thing. For example, if you were to accidentally get up and close with a wolf, now is not the time to challenge your pre-existing condition that wolves are dangerous. Do not try to pet them. Instead, your instinct would be to get away, and experts do recommend slowly backing away, retreating, and making yourself big, loud, and aggressive if the wolf tries to attack you. But other times, these biases create stories that move us from fact into fiction. We're very uncomfortable with the idea that we don't know everything and that our understanding is limited. And so we tell stories about ourselves and others that can sometimes, unfortunately, cause more harm than good. We tell stories about the motivations of the person standing with a cardboard sign on the street corner. We tell stories about the mom with the child having a meltdown in the grocery aisle while she stands back and tries to talk to them, seemingly doing nothing. And we tell stories about the teenager whose grades are slipping and always seems to be in more trouble, spending more time in detention than the classroom. What's the result of those stories that we tell ourselves and we tell others? Because the truth is, we don't have to know everything. We don't have to make up stories to pretend like we do. There's nothing wrong with not understanding something, and that is what our passage is saying to us today. We don't see everything clearly. We're only seeing a distorted image in a silver mirror. And that's all right. 1 Corinthians 13 stands as a reminder that there is more to the Christian faith than knowledge and understanding, as important as those are. Paul is reminding the church in Corinth and reminding us that what comes before everything else is love. Because love is the story that God has given us to fill in the gaps in our knowledge. When we don't or can't understand, the story we are called to tell is one of love for God, for our neighbors, and for ourselves. We are called to tell a story of love to the person on the street corner, whether that's with money or a water bottle or even just a kind smile. We are called to tell a story of compassion to the mother whose autistic child is in sensory overwhelm, who's doing her best to regulate them while not making the situation worse. And we are called to tell a story of sympathy and care when we encounter a struggling student, looking for stability and security that their home life may not provide. We don't have to make a story up to explain what we see in our dim silver mirrors, because it's already there, waiting for us to show it to everyone else we meet.